passion, right? We've layered our social mind onto our biological regulation, and we've sort of co-opted it so that they go together. And we learn how to interpret those sensations. I mean, yes?
Oh, sorry.
No, it's okay.
Actually, this made me think of actually an interview that I did. I think this is probably also emotional development and how people learn how to verbalize how they feel, because I actually just interviewed some fourth graders.
Yeah.
And we asked them, oh, so when you couldn't answer this question, how did you feel?
Yeah.
They can't answer that question. They kept talking about like what did they do or like their behaviors, but they don't answer the question of how they felt, you know, was it like, you know, shame or whatever. They can't verbalize that feeling. So I think it may be, you know, maybe developmental as well.
They can, yes, developmental, and also kids can learn it. And there's also cultural differences in how you learn it. There are some cultures where it's really not appropriate to talk about emotional feelings, okay? You know, Rwandan culture at the grandma, not any one particular person, but the Rwandan culture is like that. That's one of the reasons why they're having a hard time sort of getting over the, you know, the genocide and sort of reframing it in terms of other genocides, is because it's not that it's inappropriate, it's just not really even, like, they don't have words to talk about emotions like that. You just don't, that's just not something that is something you verbalize. Exactly. So where was it? Yeah, so he's starting with this embodied stuff, which is very cultural, also very individual, and we can show that individual differences in how people talk like that are related to individual differences in how they activate their brains too. But once he gets past that and says, okay, I've got something, when he says I'm not very good at verbalizing emotion, to me that just sort of means like, I don't know yet what I think. Just give me a moment, right? I don't really know. But then he goes back and says, okay, this is really moving, let me figure this out. So it's a cognitive thing as much as an affective thing. So that's what I really want you to see, like, and that's going to be a theme sort of throughout the course, is that social emotions and cognition and embodiment and you know, biology are all really just different lights to shine on the same person. You can look at them separately and you can examine different aspects, but they're not divorced from each other in a real person. There's no such thing as cognition without emotion, as thinking without feeling. It's impossible biologically to happen. Okay. There are some very weird kinds of epileptic seizures that cause that. We call them absence automatisms, right? Because the person looks like an automaton. They look like a robot when they do this. They're just completely blank. And you can't live like that. You also can form no memories when you're in that state, which is kind of a telling thing about the relation between emotion and memory. So he goes back to the facts. He has to cognitively pull out the facts that matter and infer psychological qualities based on that. I never told you that mother was selfless, right? I never told him that either. He figured that out, and that the little boy was, based on all the facts of the situation. So he has cakes, and he never gets to have those cakes, and he still offers them to her, but she turns down the cakes, and all this stuff goes good. Right? If my 9-year-old gives me a piece of his cake, well, you know, that's really nice of him, but that's not like selfless the way this kid was. This kid is starving, and he gets a piece of his cake, right? So in order to really appreciate the psychological quality that undergirds, or the intention that undergirds that action choice, you really have to understand the context. That's a cognitive interpretation of the context. I'm just trying to help you see like where the cognition is and where the emotion is and how these things go together, right? And then, right, he pauses, and that's, we think, related. We actually can show that individual variability here is related to default mode network activation later in the scanner, which I think is really cool. He pauses, and as he sort of turns inward to kind of assimilate all this, the way in which you assimilate is by kind of psychologically bouncing it off of your own self, your own consciousness, and your own feeling of self, which we'll talk more about later. And from there, you come to feel who you are in relation to the story. It both helps you interpret and understand the story, and it's changing who you are and what you think about yourself. It's the same kind of relationship, but that even little Nina had, right? She's feeling and bouncing and, you know, and feeding back and forth with her mom, even at 2 hours old, in a much more rudimentary, reflexive way. Whereas, what's development doing for you? The basic idea is the same, only now he's doing this in such an abstract, complex way that he doesn't even have to ever have met the guy to be able to have this kind of sort of vicarious co-regulation or resonance back and forth where they're almost regulating each other's physiology, like the mom and the baby need to actually be next to each other. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So what he's done, what development does for you, is it is it just takes these basic connections among people that start out purely reflexive and biological, they get elicited in a social context, they get specialized and brought together into groups of things, groups of abilities that are now elicited together to make a complex interaction, like little, Dorothea, or like Nora drawing a picture of herself and writing things. And from there, you get a mental idea of what this stands for in your mind, right? Nora loves you. There we go. It's right there on that paper. Nora loves you. And then from there, you can move outside of that representation of one thing that's sort of holding true, an idea about a set of actions, and you move into abstract sort of symbolic ways of manipulating the information that aren't about the here and now at all, but they're moved into a kind of another realm of purely mental kind of deliberation and inference. But that mental deliberation and inference is still tied to the biological experience of living in a body. So you never get completely divorced from that. You're building from it, and that's what development is basically about. Yes?
Is there research that talks, and I'm just thinking out loud,
Mm-hmm.
that talks about how experience either accelerates or retards that progression that you just talked about?
So there's a couple ways to think about that. So one way to think about it is sort of adaptive circumstances that are supportive, that are organizing development, but always by definition, those supportive adaptive circumstances that are going to support and foster development over time are also shaping and influencing that development. They can't be domain neutral, They've got a culture, they've got a bias, they've got a style to them. So that's one thing, right? So you might be shaping in a different way whatever's appropriate for, this context. So that's one thing to think about. So there's that kind of variability. Then there's also kids who come with different kinds of propensities and different kinds of inclinations, right, biologically. So they're inherently we're all inherently biased as we interact with the world. So that's shaping the way that the trajectory happens. And then there's also maladaptive circumstances. So there's circumstances that are not optimal for human beings, like neglect. And that really unequivocally retards your ability both biologically and social and culturally and cognitively to develop. Right? Or abuse is going to really systematically bias it and shift it in ways that specialize it for particular kinds of situations. And the rest of the world, we hope, doesn't live that way. So you're developing your skills along a thread or a means that's going to enable you to adapt and survive in the circumstances you're in. But because those circumstances are not very adaptive or generalizable to the world, we hope, they're not optimal. They're not really supporting you and developing into ways that we value as a society more generally. Does that make sense? So there's lots of sources of variability in that kind of a trajectory. Okay? Okay, so how about right now, we take like a 5-minute just quick bathroom break, just sort of stretch, and then we'll come back and do the quiz. Okay?
You guys gonna shoot right here?